On behalf of Outreach, I'd like to thank everybody for once again being here, and especially thank Georgetown University for hosting us. We are in for a treat this morning with our third and final keynoter of the conference, Amy Jill Levine. Levine. Amy Jill Levine, also known as A.J. Levine, is Rabbi Stanley M. Kessler Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace. She is also University Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies Emerita, Mary Jane Worthen Professor of Jewish Studies Emerita at Vanderbilt University. She has been working for more than 6 decades as both insider and ally towards stopping the Bible from being used to harm Jews, LGBTQ people, immigrants, differently abled individuals, and anyone who is, quote unquote, not us. Her new book, Jesus for Everyone, Not Just Christians, is out this month. Professor Levine has been awarded grants from the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the American Council of Learned Societies. In addition to receiving 3 audiences with Pope Francis, in spring of 2019, she was the first Jewish person to teach New Testament at Rome's Pontifical Biblical Institute. In 2021, she was also elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. You will also know her yesterday from our Bible panel. Ladies and gentlemen, Amy Jill Levine.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming. When you do a program on a Saturday and then there's another one on a Sunday, you just hope that people still like you. So what I was asked to do this morning is to talk for about an hour, and then we'll have a little bit of time for question and answer on the so-called Clobber passages. Last year there was a panel discussion specifically on this, and somebody from the audience asked, where did the term Clobber passage come from? And I didn't know, but I'm a good person. I went and looked it up. Or actually, I asked my son, who's a librarian. He looked it up. And we actually could not find the origin of it, but we think it comes from the work of Letha Scanzoni and Virginia Ramey Mollenkott in the 1970s, who were among the first people to start looking at kind of positive images of non-heteronormative sexuality. And they talked about passages being used by priests and pastors to clobber people. So we think that's the origin, and Son the librarian couldn't find anything else. Now granted, I don't know how hard he worked, but that's the best we can do. Special shout out this morning to Greg Walton. I don't know if you're here, because it was because of Greg and his work at Christ the King Church in Nashville that I put together this program in the first place. So whenever people have problems and they want me to talk with them, I am happy to do this. There are some people who are interested in world peace or curing cancer. I'm here to keep the Bible from being used as a rock thrown to do damage. That's why it was put on the earth. So thank you. Actually, my mother wanted me to be a lawyer. So if I can be of any help to you, I would consider that to be a blessing. So please do not hesitate to contact me if there's anything that I can do to help you. This morning, we'll talk about the basic Clobber passages. We'll talk about what the Hebrew and Greek say. Ideally, the Hebrew and Greek will come on here, because at least it's on my PowerPoint. And then Outreach will have copies of the slides, so you'll be able to get them from a variety of sources. We're looking at history. We're looking at exegesis, technical term for trying to figure out what the Bible is saying, so biblical interpretation. And also pastoral, because as I mentioned yesterday, I don't think the Bible, when used as a document that continues to inspire particular communities, whether the Old Testament and New Testament for the church or the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, for me as a Jew, I think those texts have to have meaning that escape their own historical context. In the church, we would call that the work of the Holy Spirit. In the synagogue, we would call it the work of people in the congregation who read critically. But it's all the same thing. So we're starting with the question of the importance of interpretation, because the Bible can be and has been used to support pretty much everything. You open it up and it's there. So the Bible got used both for supporting slavery, slaves be obedient to your masters, and abolition in Christ Jesus, there's neither slave nor free. It's been used to enhance women's rights, because we have a woman who's an apostle, Junia. We have a woman who's a deacon, Phoebe. We have women who argue with Jesus and they win the argument. Syrophoenician woman in Mark 7, Canaanite woman in Matthew 15. And then we have women should be quiet, and it was all downhill from Eve, and so on. Strip mining and fracking versus environmental preservation. I've seen those arguments. Social action versus withdrawal from society. So the basic view here, this is not a line from me. I wish I did, because I would have copyrighted it. The Bible is a rock on which to stand, not a rock thrown to do damage. So anytime the Bible is thrown to do damage, I think that's technically a misuse of the text, because as we heard yesterday, there were certain preeminent commandments, like love of God and love of neighbor, and not go hurt other people. So there are always going to be different sides of interpretation. Therefore, if somebody says, I think the Bible says X, and whatever that X is we don't like, that person may well be right, right? So that prevents us, it keeps us humble. I mean, I'm an academic. Humility is not part of the package. But it allows us to say, you know, you may have a point. So that if somebody disagrees with us, not to demonize them, not to think that they're stupid, not to think that they're superstitious, not even to think that they're bigoted. They're just trying to do the best they can reading the Bible. In terms of sexuality and gender, I'm pretty sure you know all this, but when I was putting the slides together, I figured I would give the alphabet. So I pulled this from Vanderbilt University website, my former place of employment, just so we know where people use these particular terms. When I started working on this back in the 1970s, we just had G and L. So you just kind of add things, right? And things will continue to be added. On this category, I fall in the category of ally. That's where I am. Rubrics for our discussion, so we know where we're going. Sort of ground rules. For people who open the Bible and say, this is an answer book and this will give me my answers to every single question I have, no! You know, and anybody who's ever taken a biology exam knows this. No, the Bible doesn't tell you everything you need to know. You know, tell me the major blood types. So the Bible is basically, I think, a book that helps us ask the right questions. That's, in fact, what Jesus is doing when he teaches in parables. He doesn't say, for the most part, here's what it means. Sometimes Luke comes in and gives us a gloss. But the Bible is designed to make us think. The Bible is a conversation written over many, many centuries, written by a number of people who have different views. That's why, and I think this is terrific, we have 4 Gospels. Because anybody who says, well, I understand Jesus perfectly, well, if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John needed supplementation, nobody else here does either. So we need to read this text as a text to help us engage, to ask questions, to meet with other people in our community so that we can check our own opinions and hone those own opinions. When I work in the Bible, gender, and sexuality, and I'm over at Catholic University for the Catholic Biblical Association during these same meetings, so I'm giving a talk tomorrow night on New Testament and anti-Semitism. Talks about the New Testament and anti-Semitism, or the Bible, religion, gender, and sexuality, are not just academic subjects. They actually impact people's lives. And what I would like to see, and this is just a nod to my colleagues, some of you were here in biblical studies, I would like to see more biblical studies people actually step up and do more pastoral stuff, rather than just keep it in the classroom. I think we have this gift, we might as well do it. We should, thank you. I'll bring the message over to Catholic University later today. We should not demonize people who disagree, because they're also in the divine image. I mentioned yesterday I have an aunt, oh my God, hell on wheels. She too is in the divine image, right? They all have to be. So that when people protest, I will usually, particularly I've got people backing me up, go out and engage, and I will smile at them, and I will talk with them. And I've not changed anybody's mind, I think, but at least while I'm talking to them, they're no longer protesting. So we have to remember that, because I don't want to demonize people. As soon as we demonize people, we're giving them too much power. You're an agent of Satan. Well, that's above the human pay grade. But as long as you keep them on a human level, there's a possibility of engagement. Next, number 4. The Bible is less a one-size guide that fits all and more an anthology produced in particular context, which also means that when we're looking for the Bible for particular advice, and this might be especially true when it comes to some of Paul's letters, is what we are being told designed for that particular audience in that particular location, or is this teaching designed for all people at all time? So I frequently suggested to people that Paul says in 1 Corinthians, and I said, fine, I'm not living in Corinth, and I'm not living in the 1st century, and why am I reading somebody else's mail? So we need to be very concerned about to whom these texts are addressed. For Catholics, for Jews, for Eastern Orthodox, for Anglicans, so Protestants are on this side here, the Bible is not the only source of what we know. And we talked about this yesterday. We've got tradition. So you've got the entire Catholic tradition. You've got 2,000 years of stuff, right? You're not just stuck with the Bible. We've got questions of revelation. And people every once in a while have revelations. We've also got science. So that if we say the Bible is all that we need, probably not. The Bible's not going to give you a COVID shot, which I think is a good thing. To avoid the sin of bibliolatry, which is worshiping the Bible, right? So what we're supposed to do is worship that to which the Bible points. Right? So as soon as we make the Bible God, we're taking out tradition and revelation and community and science. So the Bible is one mechanism to get us to God, but it's not the only one. The only way we can really understand the Bible is if we engage it, and God gave us brains. So just to read the text in some sort of literal level is not going to be helpful very much. And by the way, if somebody says, I take the Bible literally, unless you're dealing with a fundamentalist Protestant using the King James Version, all you have to do is say which translation. And things will change, as we know. So we have the problem here of what does the text say, and then we have the other question of what does the text mean. So I've been with Partner for over 40 years, and every once in a while, Partner will say something, and I will react in a way that Partner does not anticipate. And I will say, why did you say that? And Partner will say, well, you said this. And I will say, but that's not what I meant, right? And he's supposed to know that. Of course, I perfectly understand all the time. If we misunderstand our friends, who we have known, if we misunderstand our lovers with whom we've been together for half a century, we're likely to misunderstand the text. So even when I think I know what the text says, you, male person, shall not lie with a man the lyings of a woman, I then need to figure out what exactly that means, like what exactly is being forbidden. I also want to know what purpose it serves. And the Bible frequently gives us instruction without telling us why. Now, I know when people are children, parents will say, don't do that, and the child will say, why? And the parent's response is, because I said so. Generally, by the time we're 5, that no longer works. So what we can do as academics, what we can do as historians, is try to determine why the Bible is giving the advice that it's giving. And if we determine that we no longer find the why to be helpful, then we might want to reassess what the Bible itself is saying. And finally, is the instruction limited or universal? What constitutes sexual relations? So, the problem here, if you keep laughing, I'm not going to get through my slides, right? The problem here, in part, is that my students don't know who this is. Okay, so when Mr. Clinton said about Miss Lewinsky, I did not have sex with that woman, he was defining sex in a very particular way, penis penetrating a vagina or something. So I don't know his taste. But speaking of which, but for Mr. Clinton, oral sex did not count as sex. My friend Marty, who's about 15 years older than I am, so he's in his 90s, it talked about when he was a camp counselor, when he was quite much younger, a little kid in his camp group said, I had sex with her, and Marty, like 5-year-olds, and Marty was appalled and said, what did you do? And he said, I kissed her. So even when we're talking about sex, we need to define what exactly we mean. As mentioned yesterday, there's no indication of prohibition against lesbianism in the Old Testament, to use the Christian terminology, because mostly for the Bible, sex means penile penetration, whether by a human being or by an animal, by the way. It does forbid bestiality. So if you're thinking about bestiality, don't do it. It's forbidden, because you can't get permission, right? But no penis, no problem. So even here, what constitutes sexual relations? Now, there are certain canonical touchstones. So canon is the official list of scripture. And in both Judaism and Christianity, there are certain texts that are more important and certain texts that are less important. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 23, which is the invectives against Pharisees and scribes, like, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, because you do everything. Jesus says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, because you neglect the weightier matters of the law. Right, you tithe mint, but you neglect justice and so on. So that's a very Jewish way of thinking about things. According to Jesus, this is Mark chapter 12, a scribe says to Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus, who never, as far as I can tell, answers a question directly, which means, by the way, he has had media training, right? Because they teach you that. He might have invented it. He answers the question that he wants to answer. He says, well, there are actually two. Love of God, Deuteronomy chapter 6, and love of neighbor, Leviticus chapter 19. So those are the touchstones. We also have in the Sermon on the Mount something usually called the golden rule, do to others as you would have them do to you, because that is the law and the prophets. It doesn't mean that's all you have to do, but that's your starting point. In Rabbinic Judaism, we have something called the silver rule. What is hateful to you, don't do to anybody else. All the rest is commentary. Go and learn. And we need that addition, because if we just say do to others, then we're going to impose our will on other people. Right? And if we just say don't do, then we can't be proactive. So we have to have certain starting points. And here you have the weightier commandments. When it comes to translation, all translators are traitors. Oh, my Greek and Hebrew worked. Isn't that great? So when people tell me the Bible says, and I have this on my computer, so I can just pull out a bunch of files at the same time. God bless technology. King James Version, which our Protestant friends, some of whom are still reading, there shall be no whore or sodomite. NRSV UE, updated edition. You shall not serve in an illicit shrine. To me, there's a big difference between whore and serving at an illicit shrine. An illicit shrine, prostitute. Cult prostitute. We're not even sure there were any, by the way. The fee of a whore, or the New American Bible Revised Edition, temple prostitute, prostitute's fee. So even when people say, well, the text talks about sodomites, it really depends upon the translation that we're looking at. The Greek term that you can see up on the top is porne. It's where we get words like pornography. And we don't even know what that means, right? The great Supreme Court definition of pornography, I know it when I see it. Not terribly helpful. Here's 1 Corinthians 6:9. This is one of the so-called Clobber passages. Pornoi, the same word. So we had whore before, temple prostitute. Now we've got fornicators, or those who engage in sexual sin. And then I have to stop and say, what counts? You know, what can I do? What's good? Fornicators, sex out of marriage, probably. Male prostitutes, or effeminate. The Greek term is malakos. Malakos means somebody who drives an automatic rather than a stick. I mean, it's a soft person. Somebody spends more time in the harem or on the couch than in the gym. It's nothing to do with being effeminate. Fornicators, boy prostitutes, male prostitutes, effeminate. When people say the Bible says, it's always going to be a problem. I hope that point's clear. Good. Okay. Positive sexuality, just so we know where we're starting. The body is in the image and likeness of God, and it is the temple of the Holy Spirit. It's a good thing. So if we don't start with body positivity, we'll come back to this at the end, we're not going to make it through the rest of the day. The first commandment, as noted yesterday, was be fruitful and multiply. It's a very positive commandment. It's not a thou shalt not, it's a thou shalt. And as we learned yesterday, this is not the most important commandment ever. We already were fruitful and multiplied and filled the earth at the end of the scene of the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11. That's one that you can say, check that off one. That one's done. And as mentioned yesterday by our friend Jim, I praise you for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. So the human body is not something to be disgusted at or looked at and thought of with shame. The human body is like, we're fabulous. I think that's a good way of starting. Positive sexuality, and we mentioned this yesterday as well. Genesis 18:12, you remember this by Tchaikovsky's Overture, where the cannons go off, where Sarah says, and the NABRE, the Catholic Bible, they got this one right. Now that I am worn out and my husband is old, am I still to have sexual pleasure? Can you just imagine that in a homily? Am I still to have sexual pleasure? Oh, God, that would be fabulous. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. Oh, fabulous. So the Bible has lots of positive sexuality. Does the Bible mention homosexuality? No, because the word hadn't been coined yet. It appears in the 19th century in English in 1887. So when somebody says, what does the Bible say about homosexuality? The answer is nothing. Now, that only gets us so far. because the Bible doesn't say stuff about a lot of other things. Like, what does the Bible say about cancer? It actually doesn't say anything. But there are certain diseases that look like that might be the problem, or heart attacks, or whatever. So just because the Bible doesn't say something about it, one can still look back and say, I think it's here, but you can look back positively, I think it's here. Or you can look back negatively, it's here. So the question of what does the Bible say can also be adapted. When we talk about homosexuality or just general, what do we mean? Are we talking about an act, something that somebody does, or are we talking about a disposition, or are we talking about a culture? So there are a lot of gay people who are celibate for one reason or another. There are also a lot of heterosexual people who are celibate. So when people want to talk about action, that's one thing. If people want to talk about orientation, that strikes me as quite something else. So when people start saying, what does the Bible say about? You can always be, what exactly are we talking about? Are we talking about doing something? And then as soon as you say, are we talking about doing something, then just look at the person and say, what? Because they don't want to use the words. Make them use the words, and once they use the words, now we have a place to have a conversation. First Clobber passage, Leviticus 18:22 and 20:30, they basically say the same thing. You, male person, singular, the Hebrew was zachar. In the creation narrative, God created them male and female. So male, you male person, shall not have the lyings with, or this lying down with, or the sleeping with, the Hebrew is shachav, with a woman. It is an abomination. And then repeated in 20:30, if a male, as with a female, lies, this is a very literal translation, both of them have committed an abomination, they shall surely be put to death. Okay, now, so this is, I know what the text says. I don't know what it means. I think I know what it means, but I don't know for sure what it means. And if I don't know for sure what a text means, I'm not going to build a law around it. That's just too much hubris. What does it mean and what does it forbid? So generally, people will say, in terms of Clobber passages, this is a text that says two men cannot have sexual relations with each other. That may well be the case, but we can look at other things that may be forbidden. Is it anal intercourse between men? My kids are like, Mommy, what are you talking about today? We're talking about anal intercourse for about 10 minutes. Are we talking about intracrural, which is between the thighs? And that's usually the pederasty in the Roman era, right? Older men and teenage boys. Are we talking about rape in war or in prison? Because that sort of thing happens. Are we talking about pederasty? Are we talking about spilling seed, right? Wasting semen. In the book of Genesis, chapter 38, there's a story about a lady named Tamar who's married to a fellow named Er. These are Abraham's great-grandchildren. Er's the great-grandchild. And Er does something wicked, so God kills him, because this is Genesis and that happens. In a system known as levirate marriage, which nobody is trying to enforce these days, lever is Latin for brother-in-law. And the idea is if you're married and your husband, you're heterosexually married, your husband dies, you don't have a kid, you marry the brother-in-law, and then you and the brother-in-law conceive a child, and the child you conceive inherits the dead husband's name and estate. This would be if, heaven forbid, husband and I did not have kids, I'd have to marry Uncle Gary. So Tamar gets married to the second brother, whose name is Onan, whose name gives us the word onanism, which means masturbation, which is not what he was doing. What he was doing is practicing a very inexact form of birth control and withdrawing, and then the text says he spilled his seed upon the ground. So here we have a problem of what does the text say, what does it mean? People who say it means masturbation actually misread the text. It's bad form of birth control. Just side note on that, this is Dorothy Parker. Dorothy Parker is the one who said men don't make passes at girls who wear glasses, except they do. Dorothy Parker named her bird Onan because he spilled his seed upon the ground. It's just... So let's go back here. What's probably going on here is the text is concerned about gender roles. So here's where the language is important. If the text had said, you male person, do not put your penis in the following locations, then it's clear. But what they're concerned about is gender roles. Don't lie with a man as if that man is a woman, right? Because that's putting a man in the woman's position and the woman's position in the gender hierarchy. God's here, men are here, and women are here. That's just the way it works in the Bible. Every once in a while, things get shifted. You don't want to put the man in the lower position. That's part of what the problem is. So it's a confusion of gender roles. It's turning a man into a woman. And the text generally does not like that. In one Jewish commentary that I found that I thought was quite helpful, the text is, you male person shall not lie with a man the lyings of a woman. What does this mean? It means that if you are a gay man and you have a man as a partner, don't treat your partner like your partner's a woman. Treat your partner like your partner's another man. And there's no reason to conform to heterosexist gender norms if you're a gay couple. You're just a gay couple. Now, did Leviticus intend that? Probably not. Is it a legitimate reading of the text? You bet. Moving over. What are abominations, right? Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that run to evil, and a lying witness and somebody who sows discord in the family. I want that list up next time somebody says it's an abomination. A false balance is an abomination. So when people start forbidding all this stuff first, let the other stuff come later. We're never going to get there. Why is the act forbidden? Well, we've already suggested a few things on this. Some people say because that's what Canaanites are doing, and they probably were, because non-heteronormative folks have existed throughout the centuries. But Canaanites are also engaging in heterosexual intercourse because that's how you get little Canaanites. So I don't think the Canaanite thing is the problem. People have argued that we need to forbid gay relations because otherwise the family will not be intact. But this is not the case either, because if it were, then they would have forbidden prostitution and they would have forbidden concubinage. And they don't. Plus, they're polygynous. To prevent population decline. Well, this doesn't work either. First of all, there are gay dads. There may be some of you out there, right? So there are gay dads. So that's not the issue. And if you're a gay dad, right, so you have your relationship, and depending upon how vigorous you are, 20 minutes later or half an hour, whatever, then you can go have sex with your wife, right? So I don't think it's to keep the population up. And a number of people have recently suggested it's a medical concern to avoid things like anal tearing. I don't think so. Why? Because anal intercourse is not forbidden between men and women, right? So one way of determining what these things are trying to do is try to figure out what is and what is not forbidden. So I don't think any of this stuff works. We go back to the gender roles. And the gender roles are part of the larger concern of the Bible. In the Bible, men do men things and women do women things because that's the way the world works. Now, the thing is, gender roles have changed over the centuries, right? When I was a kid, women baked and men barbecued. And now I watch Great British Bake Off, and the men are fabulous, right? Change roles. In Judaism, our Torah portions, our Pentateuchal portions are divided into parashah, kind of like your lectionary readings. Leviticus shows up in parashah kedoshim. Kedoshim means to be holy. You might be familiar with words like kaddish or kiddush. So holiness is separation. Starting off in Leviticus 19:1, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And holiness is a matter of separation, like the sacred from the profane, dietary regulations, the Sabbath from the work week, Israel from the nations. Creation is a form of separation. God separated the waters above from the waters below. So what Leviticus here is doing is playing on this idea of separation. Men do men things, women do women things. But if we don't think that separation model still holds, then Leviticus doesn't hold either. Gender roles, as with the woman. And you can get another sense of how these gender roles function in the book of Deuteronomy, which says, a woman shall not wear a man's apparel, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment, because whoever does such a thing is abhorrent to the Lord. When I was a kid, I'm from Massachusetts, when I was a kid in the public school system, in elementary school, girls had to wear skirts in the winter? Right? How dumb. You know, so I kept saying to my mother, why can't I wear pants? Because you're a girl and they won't let you in the public schools. I mean, this is so silly. So what do we mean by this? Kilts, great fashion, comfortable, so I've been told. If we're not going to enforce this, why are we enforcing some of this other stuff? There are a number of Christian interpretations of Leviticus 18 and 20. For example, the laws in Leviticus should be no more relevant than any other ritual law. Over at Catholic University this morning for breakfast, you know, like sausage, bacon, whatever, pork was on the menu. Or gender roles are eliminated, given that in Genesis 1, men and women, male and female, are both created in the image and likeness of God. Or Galatians 3:28, in Christ Jesus, there's not male and not female. Or for some interpretations, this is a Methodist interpretation, some Methodists, experience and reason take precedence over Scripture, especially vague Scripture. So in the same way that slavery can be debated, some Protestants are saying there are other ways around it. Here's one Jewish interpretation. For a number of male Orthodox Jews, gay men, they believe the text forbids anal intercourse, but it doesn't forbid any other form of sexual expression. So they'll limit, but my friends have said to me, and then what do they do? Staggering lack of imagination on their part. And here's Arthur Waskow. Gay men need not mimic heterosexist norms. So even if people do want to, and Waskow's a Jew, so even if people do want to take these laws literally and put them into practice, they still have to interpret them. What I want to do is take a page out of Jesus' playbook, because I think Jesus is really smart. Jesus forbids divorce, although Deuteronomy says you can get divorced. So what does Jesus do? Jesus says, from the beginning it was not so, and he goes back to Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. You know, it's not good that a man should be alone, right? So a man leaves his father and mother and cleaves to his wife and all that. So Deuteronomy says you can get divorced. Jesus says Genesis trumps Deuteronomy. That's a bridge term, not a political term. Genesis trumps Deuteronomy, all right? You have to be clear about that because people have called me on that. Oh, you saying? No. So Genesis is more important than Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy says you can get divorced. Genesis says you can't. Well, why not take the same page? Leviticus says probably there shall not be male-male sexual relations. But in the beginning, God says it's not good that a human being, the Hebrew is ha-adam, the human, should be alone. I will make a helper as his partner. So if God says it's not good for the human being to be alone, why condemn a gay person who doesn't have the gift of celibacy to a life of singleness? I mean, that strikes me as counterproductive and counter to the Bible. And I talked with Jesus about this, and he liked it. We chat. What does the Bible say about homosexuality? As already noted, nothing. But there's an old line in biblical studies that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? Just because it's not said, it doesn't mean that it's not hinted at. And we've already seen those hinted at in the book of Leviticus, and we'll get there when it comes to Romans as well. But what the text also does is give us various configurations, and we heard about this yesterday, in terms of fictive kinship models. Who are my mother and brothers and sisters? That's a non-heteronormative family because there's no dad, there are no kids. Pair bonding, and with whom do you go? So this is the Ruth and Naomi and David and Jonathan. Jesus is always a bridegroom, but he's never a bride. There's a movie on that, like Six Bridesmaids, but it's now Jesus. Which means when you're in the presence of Jesus, unless it's Lent, it's like being at a wedding where people in different families come together and they bond, and there should be joy and celebration. It's a gorgeous image. But he's never a husband, except in the epistle to the Ephesians where he marries the church, which I think is like a different form of relationship. So Jesus himself does not correspond to normative gender roles. Not all Jews in the first century got married. We do have a kind of streak of celibacy running through first century Judaism. But it's not normal. Most people got married and make babies. The fact that Jesus was celibate, I think, puts him in the other category, which means he's looking at other forms of expression, so that fulfillment is not married and children. Fulfillment is something else. Jesus, not married, does not procreate. He has no biological children. But does he give birth? Is he gender fluid? As I mentioned yesterday, I think that he is. One of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and forthwith, I'm not sure anybody still uses the term forthwith, came there out blood and water. That's a parturition image. That's a giving birth image. Jesus has just given birth to the church. And for people who want to take that even farther, he's just been penetrated to give birth to the church. I want to take this as gender fluidity. So the cool thing about Jesus, one of the many cool things about Jesus, is you can't put him in a box. Once you think you got him, there's something else over there that's saying you have to look again. You have to look again. So I think he provides us alternative family structures and alternative ways of performing what it means to be masculine. What does Jesus say about family values? Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, and even life cannot be my disciple. Most people aren't going there, right? But what's more important than family? Faith. Those who belong to this age marry, and they're given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy of a place in the age and in the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. So what Jesus is trying to do is instruct his followers to live as if they've already got one foot in the kingdom of heaven. That's what the Sermon on the Mount is. Live as if you've got one foot in the kingdom of heaven, where you figure out what's absolutely important and what's less important. What's absolutely important, loving your neighbor as yourself. What's less important, get married, make babies. So he's already suggesting alternative family constructions. So here's a trivia question for you. We can do this after, right? If you're a professor, you don't get to play. With the exception of Mary and Joseph, I think I mentioned this yesterday, with the exception of Mary and Joseph, there's only one married couple in the entire gospel tradition to whom Jesus speaks, which means the vast majority of people surrounding him, even if they are married, like Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward, for example, or Mrs. Zebedee, the mother of James and John, married couples are separated, and the priority is to what anthropologists call fictive kinship units. The family not connected by marriage and not connected by birth, but in effect, to use John's language, born anew or born from above. Different family values. So as soon as somebody says, it's leave it to Beaver, no, it's not. Now, here's just something to be wary of. Beware of the anti-Semitic move of saying that first century Judaism is the problem because of issues of purity laws and Jesus does away with all that stuff. Because I've seen a number of pro-LGBTQI plus advocacy folks saying Judaism was the problem, the Old Testament was the problem, and Jesus fixes everything. It's just an Old Testament move, and it's trying to gain liberation on the back of anti-Semitism. So please do not go there. And this is our general problem, is that those of us who face prejudice are not always adept at recognizing the negative stereotypes of other people. So I just want you to be aware of that. When it comes to purity regulations, by the way, Jesus doesn't dismiss purity laws at all. He restores people to states of ritual purity. Romans. Romans. Gentiles, which basically means not Jewish, not Samaritan, failed to recognize God despite creation and conscience. We would call this natural theology. So what they wind up doing is they turn to idols rather than worshiping God. And here's the Clobber passage. It's Romans 1:26, 1:27. God handed them over to degrading passions. Their females exchanged natural relations for unnatural. And that's typically looked at as the only reference to lesbians in the Bible. But you know what? Women have wonderful imaginations. So when we start talking about what would be an unnatural relation in the first century, a relation that does not lead to procreation. So for some people in the early church, this was a concern about anal intercourse, oral intercourse, mutual masturbation, nothing to do with lesbians whatsoever. So even when I have unnatural, I have to figure out what that means. And males gave up natural relations with females, so that's male and women. And they burned with lust for one another, and then they did shameful things. And then they received in their own bodies due penalty for their perversity. And this is where we get the idea that AIDS is a sin, and AIDS was used to punish gay people. This is the verse where it comes from. It's not what Paul is talking about whatsoever. Because Paul's sense is the body that engages in shameful actions is alienated from God. It's got nothing to do with disease. So here's the Greek, in case you want to know it. The women exchanged natural use, physic and chresin, for unnatural, paraphysin. And phusin, that's where we get the word physics. That's like natural stuff. St. Augustine, you've heard of him? There's probably a picture of him somewhere in its campus. Clement of Alexandria, anal intercourse with a man. So Augustine and Clement don't think that this thing has to do with lesbians at all. So when people say, church teaching tells me, it helps to know what the church actually said, because every once in a while the church changes its mind. So there we are. John Chrysostom decided it was lesbianism. Fabulous book, Love Between Women. This is by Bernadette Bruton, who got a MacArthur Genius Grant on the basis of this book. Fabulous person. If you want to know about lesbians in antiquity, Bernadette Bruton found them all. Here's Eve Cantarella's article on bisexuality, where she's talking about images of lesbians in the first century, and what does she suggest? The most serious crime that women could commit was thinking they could do without men. Yeah, okay. Roman cultural context. This is I can't even pronounce his name. You read it. Roman emperor who cross-dressed. Interesting. General Roman cultural context. Jews thought that Gentiles were sexually licentious. Jews and Gentiles both were not happy with non-procreative intercourse and therefore not happy with male-male or female-female. And there was in Roman society a stigmatization of any man who accepted the so-called female role, the passive partner, the penetrated partner, unless you happen to be the Roman emperor. For Paul, When Paul says something is contrary to nature, what he's really doing is talking about what's contrary to culture. In 1 Corinthians, he says, does not nature teach you that if a man wears long hair, it's degrading for him, but if a woman has long hair, it's her glory? Well, no, nature doesn't teach us that at all. Back in certain cultures, being left-handed was considered to be contrary to nature. My mother, when she was born in 1913, when she went to elementary school, her first grade teacher tied her left hand behind her back because being left-handed was considered to be contrary to nature. Today we would call that child abuse. So even when we have terms like contrary to nature, we need to figure out what they mean. Is contrary to nature bad? Not necessarily. The same term in Greek shows up in Romans 11:24. Talking to Gentiles, non-Jews, if you have been cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature, paraphusin, into a cultivated tree, how much more will the national branches be brought back? Gentiles gain their salvation by an act of God that is contrary to nature. Reading Paul in context. And I got this idea from James Allison, whose work some of you I'm sure know. Romans 1 ends with, although they know the just degree of God, that all who practice such things deserve death, the very next line is, so you're without excuse if you pass judgment. So if we just read one more verse in Romans, we have to stop passing this judgment and condemning people. Yesterday, somebody asked about later church tradition where we do have hand fasting rituals. So this is the example of it. This is the funeral relief of Fontana Helena and Fontana Eleusis. It was originally a man and a woman, and you can see where they've been chiseled. These are two women, and this is a sign of marriage bonding. So we've actually got lesbian archaeological artifacts. In terms of 1 Corinthians, the NABRE, do you not know that the unjust will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Fornicators, pornoi, okay. Boy prostitutes, but this is malakoi, and malakos just means soft. Sodomites, arsenokatoi, and everybody else, like the thieves, the greedy, the drunkens, the revilers, the robbers. And as far as I can tell, the thieves, the greedy, the drunkards, the revilers, the robbers still get to take communion pretty much everywhere. So why? The term arsenokatoi is first used by Paul. And we always have a problem if we have a word we're not sure what it means, right? So we have to figure it out. Arsen is the word for male. You can see that in the Greek translation of Genesis 1, male and female arsen. And kotoi, you know, coitus, it means bed. So arsen means male and kotoi means bed. And the two words, arsenos and kritis is the bed, actually show up together in one of those Clobber passages in Leviticus. So a number of people think that Paul coined the term to refer to men who sleep with other men, because that's pretty much how Leviticus was being interpreted in the first century. But then I got to figure out what it means, like male betters, men who lie with men, pimps who help men find other people to lie with. Sex, male prostitutes. Martin Luther, who usually doesn't get cited in a Catholic context, thought this had to do with masturbation. There is no text that forbids that, just so you know. 1 Timothy, last one. The law is meant not for the righteous, but for the lawless and unruly, the unchaste, pornoi. Why doesn't it say fornicators? Sodomites, that's arsenokatoi again. And then kidnappers. So what may be going on here, and I got this idea from a now deceased scholar named Dale Martin, the subject could be prostitutes, males who have sex with them, and slaves dealers who procure them, because a lot of prostitutes were enslaved people. In which case, we're not talking about willing, consenting adults. We're talking about an abusive system where people are kidnapped or taken as war captors or sold into slavery, and then people who benefit from that system. So even when we have the words, we need to figure out what they mean. Finally, in Jude, there's a reference to strange flesh and unnatural vice. Sarkos heteros. This is sleeping with angels. Most people don't have the opportunity, so we'll move on. There are other arguments here. From the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, I trolled their website. In the beginning, God created human beings in his own image, meaning that the complementary sexuality of a male and female, man and woman, is a gift. But what I want to do is read this text as a merismus. A merismus is this end and everything in between. God created heaven and earth and all that is in them, right? So why not read, God created male and female, gender norms, polar opposites, and everything that's in between. I'm not sure this has to be complementary. The purpose of sexual desire is to draw man and woman together in the bond of marriage, the expression of marital love, and the procreation and education of their children. But the problem here is not all marriages produce kids. You can try. Infertility, by the way, for biblical perspective, is actually a disability. If you want to have a kid and you can't, it means your body is not doing something that the body should be able to do. So infertility gets cast as a disability. God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. That's not from the USCCB. But God created Steve too. And finally, people who say, oh, let's cite Genesis. It's not good that the human being, Ha-Adam, the Adam, should be alone. I will make him a helper as his partner, an Ezer Kenegdo. And people say, well, what does the woman do to help? She makes the babies, right? Because that's the one she can do that sheep and whatever else can't do. But that's restricting the role of women to wombs. And for those of us who are, thank God, past the possibility of ever having a child again, I now have no purpose. So I don't think that Genesis is restricting women simply to wombs. What did the Adam look like? Sometimes it helps to go to later tradition. From the Jewish tradition, and this is actually coming from some Greek thought from Plato, when Adam was created, he was created back to back, and sometimes you get two men, and sometimes you get two women, and then you spend the rest of your life looking for your partner. Or even from Rabbi Samuel ben Nachman, using a Greek term, God created Adam as an androgyne. So the rabbinic tradition allows for different forms of sexuality. Gender fluidity in the Talmud is also there. The Talmud recognizes 6 types of gender performance. So even when we go to later tradition, there's stuff that's usable. I'll just leave this up there on the screen. You can check it later. What is Adam's rib, just because people ask? In terms of male bodies, men and women have the same number of ribs. We should know that. So what is this piece that got taken from Adam's body and got created into Eve? Well, the Hebrew doesn't say rib. It says sella. Sella means side. Sella is like a side to your house. It goes like this. So here's your house, here's the side. You may be able to figure out where I'm going here. So people back then would have seen carcasses, like animal carcasses, donkey carcasses, dog carcasses, and whatever. And it turns out that males are the only mammals that don't have a penis bone. A penis bone, by the way, is called a baculum. That has another meaning, but you can work that out on your own. So it may be that this rib that God took was the penis bone. I'm not sure what you're going to do with it, but I find it fascinating. This is an article from a biologist and an Old Testament scholar. Ruth and Naomi, David and Jonathan. As mentioned yesterday, a man leaves his father and mother and cleaves, right? Davak, clings to. Same word as Adam and Eve. Or David of Jonathan, I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Your love for me was wonderful, passing the love of women. On the other hand, David only expresses his love after Jonathan dies, because I'm a little worried about David, and I think he's politically conniving. By the way, he happens to be married to Jonathan's sister. So you can use him as a role model. I wouldn't. Sodom and Gomorrah, what's the sin? In Hebrew, the men of the city, the Greek makes it specifically men, like male people. But in the Hebrew, it's all the people in the city, men and women both, so therefore it's not just men with men. And the problem here is Genesis 19 is really, as we talked about yesterday, about homosexuality. Here's the quote I mentioned yesterday from Ezekiel. The problem of Sodom is that they were sated with food and they didn't give any help to the poor and needy. So if somebody says you're a sodomite, it means you're not concerned for the poor and needy. And we even have that exacerbated in Ecclesiasticus, which is in your canon. It's in the Catholic canon, not the Jewish one. He did not spare the neighbors of Lot, abominable in their pride. So what was the sin of Sodom? Lack of hospitality and pride. When we get to rabbinic sources, even more, the people of Sodom set their sights on property owners. And then, so even in rabbinic tradition, the major thing is lack of hospitality. A note on sodomy, just because it's always nice. The Latin term sodomia was coined in the 11th century by Peter Damian, and it initially denoted male sexual activity without procreation. So even when somebody says sodomite, that term has changed over time. Finishing up, unhelpful comments. To say people are contrary to nature, I think, is unhelpful. to compare gay people or LGBTQI people to alcoholics and drug addicts is unhelpful, because alcoholism and drug addiction harms. Consenting love between adults gives life. You can't pray the gay away. That doesn't work. Conversion therapy has a 98.5 by last statistic recidivism rate. This is the idea is to fix people. This is now considered an improper practice by the American Psychological Association. I've had friends who say, but there's a 1% chance, to which I responded, would you want your child to be married to a graduate of that program? And they go, well, maybe not. Right? So put it on the practical. So for some people, well, if you're, LGBTQI, whatever, just get married heterosexually, just conform. I don't want to be the wife of that person, because it's not good for the partner and it's not good for the individual, or remain celibate. Celibacy is a spiritual gift. Some of us have it, some of us don't. And I think also helpful is the idea of leaving the church or saying you're not welcome here, because I think the church should be open to everybody. The synagogue, like the church, was not designed for only the saints, right? So everybody should be welcome. And if somebody does something that somebody else doesn't like, take it up with them after. Helpful exercises. Ask questions. What do you mean by that when you say don't do that? What does the Bible mean? Use the hermeneutics of imagination. So if you can't find somebody who looks like you or acts like you in the Bible, imagine, because we don't have everybody's stories. So just as people who are not part of Middle Eastern culture can imagine themselves in the biblical text, or as painters can imagine other people in the biblical text who may not be there, we can do the same thing. Prioritizing the love command, recognizing familial or kinship diversity, moving from the Bible to tradition, using outreach material, relying on the outreach community, and finding allies. And finally, a helpful exercise. This is a bathroom mirror, but it looked labial to me. There are some baptismal fonts, by the way, in antiquity that actually look like women's genitalia, because if you're going to be born again, yep, there you go. This is why instead of talking about seminal things or seminaries, I want to talk about ovarial things. Metaphors matter. Fine. So this is an image I had when I was a kid. When you wake up in the morning, get out of the shower, stand in front of a mirror, right, stark naked, and say, this is the image and likeness of God. It's a fabulous exercise. When I was doing that when I was 18, it was pretty good. But 50 years on, it's different. But I still do this every morning, because it gives me that affirmation. This is the image and likeness of God. This is a wonderfully made whatever, no matter scars or weight gain or sags or whatever. This is wonderfully made. And if we can just start there, we're in a much better position to love ourselves and to love everybody else. Because as a great theologian once said, if you can't love yourself, how the hell are you going to love anybody else? Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay.
I'll do the question. All right, I know you have questions. We have 2 microphones, one on each aisle, and we have about 15 or 20 minutes for questions. So if you have a question for Professor Levine and you'd like to line up on either side, and there's a center, oh yes, and there's a mic in the center as well. So any one of these sides, if you have a question, you can line up there.
If you want to talk to me after, because some people think of good questions too late, that's how I normally function, or if you just want, send me an email. Right? You can find me at the Vanderbilt University, you can find me at Hartford, and I've got a Facebook page. I do not know how my Facebook page works. I have deliberately not learned, but my daughter checks it once a week. So you can, I don't want anybody being upset with me, and if you have additions that I can use to make my presentation even stronger, I would appreciate that. Comments or questions? Ooh, it's not church, right?
come in. I was very, very glad that you mentioned the caution about anti-Semitism, and I would love it if you would just talk a little bit about, the whole how we sometimes, as liberal Catholics or Christians, are not aware of, how our, conflict with purity culture can lend to that.
Thank you for the question. And there was a really good article on this conference that came out, I think, on Thursday from National Catholic Reporter. It's a splendid article. So I want to start with the positive on this. The Roman Catholic Church, in its wisdom, in 1965, determined, this is part of Vatican II, determined that Jews at all times and all places could not be held specifically responsible for the death of Jesus, and have made it very clear in Catholic teaching that Jews are still under covenant with God. They did not have to go that way. That was a biblical choice. There are passages in the New Testament that could easily take one in the other direction. And what I'd like to see is the church being open to LGBTQI people the same way, to choose how to read benevolently and kindly rather than in terms of a condemnatory model. Where the issue comes with questions of purity laws is most Christians, particularly Protestants, don't get purity laws. Purity laws are designed to move us not from the disgusting to the whatever, but to move us from the sacred to the profane. When Jews engage in purity practices, if you're in a state of ritual impurity, how do you get in a state of ritual impurity? Most people are impure most of the time, and most don't care. Right? If you menstruate, you're impure. But it's not as if you're locked in some room somewhere. I mean, just one angry woman could pollute all of Galilee, just run around and touch people. If you're a man and you ejaculate, under whatever circumstances, you are impure. You're probably happy, but you're impure. If you give birth, you're impure. So after Mary gives birth to Jesus and Elizabeth gives birth to John the Baptist, they're impure. And we have this thing about Mary and Joseph bringing baby Jesus to the temple for purity concerns, right? So they're not restricted from any sort of society. Comments that Mary had to give birth in the stable because she would have been impure, it's nonsense. There's no room in the inn to give birth. Like, you need some space. You're impure if you touch a corpse. But when Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus take Jesus' body down from the cross, they're in a state of ritual impurity. When the women go to the tomb, they're ritually impure, because if you go into a cemetery, nobody cares. But what does it do? It means you pay attention to matters of life and death, because that's what all these purity laws are about, life and death. Menstruation, birth, ejaculation, death. Today, what do? We go to a funeral, and then we go out to lunch. Back then, as you go to a funeral, and you think about some things for a little bit, and there are certain things you might do. What does purity matter for? You can't go to the temple in Jerusalem and offer a sacrifice. Nah. What does Jesus do? Jesus restores people to states of ritual impurity. He has a fellow with skin disease. The Greek is lepros, which is where we get leprosy. He cleanses him. And then he says, go to the temple and make the offering. He cleanses a woman who's got vaginal or uterine bleeding of some sort. He dries her up, according to Mark. That's what the Greek says. So he's restoring people to states of ritual purity. By the way, if you say negative things about ritual purity, not only are you wading into anti-Semitism, you're also wading into Islamophobia. Because Islam is also a legal and purity-based system. And if you want to know where purity really functions, did you celebrate Mass this morning? Did you wash your hands? Did you use Purell? Exactly. So when they're lavabo, is that it? So good for me. So when the priest washes his hands before touching the elements, that's not hygiene, because then you'd use Purell. That's ritual purity, because the priests in the temple would wash their hands before touching the sacrificial elements. And the reason the Pharisees are so concerned about hand washing, after COVID, it turns out they were right. But the reason they're concerned about hand washing is because they're an egalitarian movement who wanted to take the sanctity that was in the temple, practiced by the priests. And priests in Judaism is an inherited position. In Judaism, if your father's a priest, you're a priest. In Catholicism, not so much, right? So the idea was to take the and say, since Exodus says we're all supposed to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, then we can all practice those purity laws that the priests have when they're in the temple. So the hand-washing thing becomes an egalitarian move. Jesus is not interested in that one. The upshot is you don't need to make Judaism look bad in order to make Jesus look good. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation both today and yesterday. One of the things I find exhausting / overwhelming about the Bible, and you kind of mentioned it, like the different translations and how many of them seem to communicate very different ideas on verses that impact a lot of people. What advice do you have for those of us who are just sort of trying to get into reading it more? And how to approach like what translations to choose?
Yeah, thanks. We've had a number of gender-inclusive translations. I would dearly love to see an LGBTQI translation, and I haven't seen one yet, and I don't know if there's funding for it, but that would be the best thing. Or at least translations that were better in terms of footnotes to say this could mean this or this could mean that. I'm the editor of something called the Jewish Annotated New Testament, and what we're trying to do for the Clobber passages in Timothy and in 1 Corinthians and in Romans is to bring out a little bit more of the distinct translation, just in case some Christian happened to be using this material. It's exhausting, you're absolutely right. And for those of us who are academics, it's exhausting for us too. All translators are traitors. It's an old Italian proverb that I've just messed up because I've given it in English. It's a pun in Italian. I mean, we're never going to get it right. So what do? If you get exhausted, just say, what translation are you using? And can you read Greek and Hebrew? And if the person says no, no credibility. And if the person says, I'm using the King James Version, so you're dealing with a very conservative Protestant, you might say, well, I'm using the NABRE, or whatever the new thing that's coming out is. I don't know what the initials are. So we're reading different Bibles, and if the person says your Bible's wrong, then you're arguing about something entirely different. Right? Sometimes you just can't have those conversations, but check to figure out what the person who's arguing with. Oh, and if the person says, I'm using the King James Version because it says the authorized version on it, ask them who authorized it, right? So it was authorized by the King of England, right, I'm sure. So if it becomes exhausting, change the subject, because there's no reason for you to be exhausted by this. Or tell them to read the new outreach thing that Jim's publishing.
Thank you very much. You point out that many of the Clobber passages actually gesture toward the importance of gender roles and away from emphasis on sexual acts. That doesn't really get us too far in thinking about trans folks and their place in the Catholic Church. I'm wondering if you have any similar, maybe, defense for them.
Thanks so much. You're absolutely right. Along with looking at Jesus as displaying different forms of masculinity that can move in that direction, as noted, John 19, which is Jesus on the cross with the giving birth, you can use that. If I were to do a bigger presentation, because I was asked to talk about homosexuality, if I was doing a bigger presentation, I would go to Paul, who talks about himself giving birth, because Paul uses a lot of non-masculine imagery and sometimes feminine imagery, and that becomes helpful. I don't have real great models for women, women who transition to men, but there are some possible examples in the Hebrew Bible, particularly looking at Deborah the judge. So possible, but it's a little bit more of an overread. The use in rabbinic literature of androgynous language can get you there. So here the Talmud is actually much more helpful than the New Testament. New Testament is, you're absolutely right, it's kind of like this is where the gender roles are. So I think if I were to do this again, I would take away the concentration on the G and the L and put more concentration on the rest of the alphabet. And you're right on that. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. Something I've always said when talking about the Bible with folks, and I'm wondering if you could expand on this concept too, is, like you said, the Bible is written in certain contexts and a time and place. And how can we also use the idea of the Bible was written and Jesus lived during a time when men ran ran the world in a way very differently, and therefore the only way it could be explained was in the context of their historical time, and how to say, you can't apply those same rules, just like so many of those rules don't exist anymore because we don't follow them.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's somewhat similar to looking at the founding documents of the United States. So like all men are created equal, what that meant, free, white, and over 21, or whatever that idea is. So now you have to figure out, well, what does men mean? Well, now men just doesn't mean men. So all law codes in particular need to be interpreted over and over and over again. That's how you get the magisterium. That's how you get the Talmud. That's how you get lawyers. So figure out what it might mean in its originary context. That would be the strict constructionist model. And then figure out what are we going to do with it today, given that we know more than they knew then. And if we simply default to a strict constructionist model, for the church, you put the Holy Spirit out of business. You put canon law out of business. So here, Catholics are in a good position, as are Jews, to be able to take advantage of the traditional model. For me, the idea of saying we have to do what they did in the first century is just dumb. Because then we're reduced to playing first century Bible land, or if we're Jewish, we're reduced to playing, early Iron Age Bible land. And I don't think that's what we were meant to do. God gave us a brain, we ought to use it. So, yeah, you're right. And the problem is a lot of people who are strict constructionists don't know the history. Everybody okay? Please. Okay, Protestant tradition, literal with the Bible. So there are Protestants, and then there are Protestants. Okay, so Protestants are very good about schisming, right? Which is why in Nashville there's a different Protestant church on every corner. You can navigate, Two Baptists turn at the disciples of Christ, past the Lutherans, past the other Baptists, right? And then go on. Martin Luther came up with this idea that he called sola scriptura, which weirdly he took from the Epistle of James, which he didn't like. And the idea was to get rid of all this other tradition, right? Traditions, like Mariology, Mary's collateral damage in the Reformation, so kind of all this extra Mary stuff goes away. Additional ritual practices go away. And Luther said, you just go back to the text and you read the text, and for him reading Romans, he said, oh, this is what it means. It's all about grace. But he's reading this in light, he was an Augustinian monk, so he's reading this in light of his own Augustinian tradition, right? And it becomes a literalist thing. Why? To get rid of all this Catholic admixture, which he also, by the way, thought Jews were doing too, like we added to the text, because we did. So let's just read the text. Now, why do we have all these different Protestant churches? Because they're a different text that they glommed onto. This text, this text, this text, we interpret it this way, this way, this way, this way. So there are different, there are multiple Baptists, I can't count the numbers. There are different major groups of Presbyterians, some quite conservative, some quite liberal. There are different groups of Lutherans, some conservative, some liberal. There are Episcopalians, and then there are Anglo-Catholics, which kind of look the same, but have different bishops, and different who can get ordained and so on. So it's a matter of figuring out which Protestant denomination we're talking about. They start with the text, but then what happens? Instead of using Catholic tradition to say this is what it means, they go to the writings of Martin Luther, or they go to Calvin's Institutes, or they go to the Stone Campbell tradition. This is what gets you Christian Church or Disciples of Christ. So they're going back to their own founders and saying, this is our new tradition, and here's how we're going to understand it. Right? So the thing is, even if you know what church somebody goes to, you don't know what that person believes. You really don't, so you can't stereotype. Same thing with the synagogue, by the way. I go to an Orthodox synagogue. I don't keep kosher. My family was in the scallop business. I mean, that would be counterproductive. But I like the rabbi, and I like the community, and I love the liturgy, and I love the Bible study. So while I'm within the walls of the synagogue, I play by their rules, and then I go out and I have a ham sandwich. Yeah. Please.
Mark Hillenbrand, and thank you so much for your presentation. Talk about your concept about using the Bible to find God, And do you get any pushback on that in people who say, well, wait a minute, don't forget the Bible? So kind of help me use your kind of logic there to defend against any pushback that people say, well, now you're kind of stepping away from the Bible.
I think I understand what you're asking. If not, just follow me on this. People will sometimes say you're a biblical critic, as if to be a critic is a bad thing. And I respond, I am a lover of the Bible. I have spent my entire life reading this text and engaging with this text. If theological belief is part of it, that's terrific. I'm not a theologian. That's above my pay grade. I'm just looking at the text. But I find the text makes me a better moral person because it raises questions about morality. I think listening to Jesus makes me a better parent. It makes me a better neighbor. It actually makes me a better teacher because his pedagogy is really quite good. So I'm taking clues from him. And if the text helps me love my neighbors and myself better, I think that's doing a good job. For people who are afraid, we should probably end with this. For people who are afraid, and I've had some students who are like this, if you do too much biblical criticism, you lose your theology, right? I don't think that's right. First of all, if your theology is just hanging on by a fingernail and one lecture is going to take it away, give it up. It's not worth hanging on to. What biblical criticism should do, and what I hope that the work I do does, is to make people more in love with the Bible, to make people more enchanted with it, to take away some of those, well, why does Matthew say this and John say that? Well, then I throw the whole thing out. As opposed to saying, because Matthew's got this message to tell and John has this message to tell, and they're both worth telling, and the story's too big for just one text. So biblical scholars who spend their time pointing out this contradicts this, and the dates don't work here, and that's not how it happened, those may be factually true, but since the Bible is not a book that's designed to give me facts, it's designed to teach me about God, designed to teach me about being a neighbor, I just don't find that productive. So in my own pedagogy, and this is personal to me too, I want people to read the Bible and come out to be better people, and to avoid those, and that goes back to the anti-Semitism question, to avoid readings that are going to harm and to choose readings that are going to help. The technical term for that is hermeneutics. Right? How do you interpret with love and kindness and compassion? And if you begin with that, then the rest of it is a form of spiritual development that should bring you closer to God rather than take you away. And if it doesn't bring you closer to God, but it makes you a better person, that's not bad. And on that note, thank you very much.